My name is Zelda Bennett. I'm a 32-year-old structural engineer from Denver, Colorado. 2 years ago, I sat at my parents' dinner table and heard the words that changed everything. They gave my younger sister $150,000 to buy her dream house and gave me nothing. My father looked me straight in the eye and said, "You're the failure, Zelda. We invest in winners." That night, I walked out of their lives for good. I built my own future from the ground up. And 2 years later, my sister drove past my property, froze in disbelief, and called my dad screaming, "Dad, you need to come here, now." Have you ever been told you'd never make it only to prove everyone wrong? Tell me where you're watching from, because I know I'm not alone in this. That night was a chilly late autumn evening. The mist slipped through the window panes, blurring the soft golden glow that reflected off the oak dining table. I sat across from my parents. On the table was my mother's baked lasagna, aromatic, yet bland, like every conversation in this family. The scent of tomato sauce mixed with red wine thickened the air around us. To my right sat my sister, Jessica, her face glowing, her blonde hair gently curled, her eyes brimming with that effortless confidence, as if the world itself had been made for her. I had stayed quiet for almost the entire meal, taking small sips of wine, waiting for the right moment to speak. But when my mother set down her fork and knife and dabbed her lips with a napkin, I knew that if I didn't speak now, I would once again leave the table in silence, carrying unsaid words and the familiar ache of being left behind. I took a breath. "I have an opportunity," I said, my voice slightly trembling. "A startup in Boulder is looking for a partner to design modular sustainable homes. I can invest part of the capital, about $30,000. If it succeeds, I'd get to keep the official design rights and a share of the profits." I looked at them, hoping just once to see a flicker of interest in their eyes. But my mother only smiled, that faint, familiar smile. "Zelda, haven't you learned to be realistic yet? We don't have money for you. Your sister's getting married soon, they need a house. We just gave them $150,000 for the down payment. It's to help them settle down." "Oh." The faint sound of cutlery touching the table broke the silence. Jessica tossed her hair lightly, her proud smile not even trying to hide. I forced myself to stay calm, to keep my voice from cracking. "I'm not asking for a gift. Just a loan. I can pay it back within a year." My mother shook her head, the way someone might when a child begs for an expensive toy. "You're always chasing dreams. I don't understand why you can't be more like Jessica. She knows how to plan, how to stay safe. You just keep believing passion alone will be enough." My father, who had been silent the entire time, finally spoke. His voice was dry, each word cutting like a blade. "Jessica is successful, stable, and has a clear plan. We chose to invest in her. But you..." He paused, looking at me over the thin rims of his glasses. "You're still the same dreamer who always fails. It's too risky to trust you." I let out a hollow laugh, barely a sound. Part of me wanted to argue, to ask if they had ever actually looked at what I've built, the homes I've designed, the blueprints that made clients line up waiting. But I knew nothing would change. Every argument would be twisted into defiance. Every attempt to prove myself would only make me stubborn and difficult. The air around the table froze. Jessica poured herself more wine and glanced at me with a half smile. "Come on, don't make it awkward. Not everyone's as capable as you. You know how to take care of yourself." I didn't answer. I just stared into the wine glass before me, seeing my distorted reflection ripple in the red surface. In my mind, memories tangled together, nights working past midnight, hand-drawn sketches stained with coffee, meetings where my spatial designs were praised, the years I paid for grad school on my own without borrowing a single cent. Yet none of it mattered here. In this house, my worth always equated to a negative balance. My father kept eating, my mother went on about Jessica's upcoming wedding. I heard the clinking of spoons, their quiet laughter, and felt like I was sitting with strangers. I used to believe that if I became successful enough, they would finally be proud of me. But they never needed a reason to love me, they only needed a reason to choose someone else. When dinner ended, my mother handed Jessica a white envelope, a check for $150,000. Jessica beamed, thanking them before turning to me with a soft voice. "You'll find another opportunity, don't be upset." I smiled faintly and said, "No, Jess, my opportunities don't come from anyone else." As I drove home, the streetlights reflected off the windshield, flickering in rhythm with my heartbeat. I didn't cry. The anger had been around for too long to turn into tears. What I felt instead was emptiness, as if someone had erased my entire history from the memory of those who were supposed to remember me. When the light turned red, I switched on the radio. An old Fleetwood Mac song played, Stevie Nicks' voice stretching through the night, so hauntingly sad that my chest tightened. I thought about the past. My childhood was measured by the sound of cicadas in the summer and the endless afternoons I spent on the porch, stacking Lego blocks into imaginary skyscrapers. When I was 6, my mother gave birth to Jessica. For the first 3 years of my life, I was the center of that small universe until she arrived, bringing with her a light I would never have again. The adults called Jessica the miracle baby. My mother often told people she had miscarried twice before Jessica was born, and when she finally came into the world, it was as if the entire house was reborn. New curtains, freshly painted walls, a new crib, and a new kind of love. And me? I slowly learned to step aside. I still remember the morning my mother brought Jessica home from the hospital. I stood by the crib, excited to see the tiny baby wrapped in a pink blanket. I reached out to gently touch her little finger, smiling, but my mother immediately brushed my hand away. "Careful, Zelda, don't hurt her," she snapped, sharper than necessary. I pulled my hand back, cheeks burning. From that moment, I understood that in this house, there was a being everyone had to protect, and my role was to learn how not to break what was precious. As the years passed, Jessica grew like a flower tended to daily. Golden hair, round rosy cheeks, a bright, effortless smile. Everyone said she looked like Mom, while I resembled Dad. Brown hair, darker skin, deep-set eyes, and a mouth that always seemed too serious. Mom liked to joke. "Zelda's the brains of the family, but Jessica's the heart." Yet I knew, from the way she said it, that the heart really meant the one who's loved. I was never good at fitting in, but I loved books and loved taking things apart to see how they worked. While other children played with dolls, I spent hours fiddling with my father's old toolbox, learning how to fasten screws and solder wires. At school, I stood out not because of looks, but because of my curiosity and my knack for math. When I was 12, I entered the state science fair with a miniature suspension bridge built from wire and drinking straws that could hold the weight of a book. I never expected to win, but I did. As they placed the medal around my neck, I scanned the audience for my parents' faces. They weren't there. That weekend, Jessica was competing in a city-level child beauty pageant. That evening, I brought the medal home, excited to show my father. He glanced at it once, then turned on the TV. "Such a strange girl," he said flatly. "What kind of daughter plays with machines?" I can still remember the sound of his voice, steady and cold, like metal striking metal. My mother sat beside him, saying nothing, just stroking Jessica's hair as she sat in her lap. Jessica looked up and smiled, showing off her Little Miss Sunshine trophy. The glow from the television made her trophy shimmer, while my medal looked like a dull piece of brass. In the years that followed, the distance only widened. My mother took Jessica to dress fittings, dance lessons, and singing classes, while I taught myself basic programming and technical design from old CDs. Every dinner conversation revolved around Jessica's schedule, photo shoots, vocal training, church performances. If I spoke about my own day at school, they would only murmur a distracted, "Uh-huh." I once believed that if I just tried a little harder, they would finally see me. But every effort only made me fade further. I used to believe that a parent's love was like gravity, natural, unconditional, and constant, but I was wrong. In that house, love was distributed like an investment. Whoever promised the highest emotional return received the most. I didn't bring pride, I brought inconvenience. Slowly, I learned to shrink myself, to hide my passions, even to hide the times I got straight A's so I wouldn't be accused of showing off. After graduating from the University of Texas, I left Colorado Springs without looking back. Denver greeted me with its dry, crisp air and snow-capped mountains in the distance, a quiet reminder that I was starting from zero. I rented a small apartment in Capitol Hill, so sparsely furnished that every footstep echoed. I worked as a structural engineer for a mid-sized construction firm, a job that demanded more than I expected, but it was the first thing that made me feel like I belonged somewhere. On my first day at the site, I stood among towering steel frames, listening to the sharp crackle of welding torches, the scent of cement dust mixing with the cold air, and for the first time in years, I felt free. No one called me weird. No one told me to stop doing men's work. It was just me, the job, and the things I could build with my own hands. The first 3 years in Denver were a blur of work and learning. I didn't just survive, I began to rise. I managed small projects, then became the technical supervisor for a new office complex downtown. I worked 12-hour days and spent weekends studying design manuals and new software. Every time I passed one of the buildings I'd helped design, I lifted my head and watched the light reflect off its glass frame, feeling a quiet pride flicker inside me. I didn't need anyone's approval. At least now, I had escaped my family's shadow. But no matter how far I went, the invisible thread that tied me to them never really broke. Every time I called home, my mother would remind me, "Jessica's getting a raise at her media company," or "Jessica's dating the son of a businessman, his family owns a hotel chain in Dallas." I would simply say, "I'm happy for her," and fall silent. Sometimes my father would take the phone, his tone cold and precise. "Have you saved anything yet? Or are you still wasting money on useless things?" I'd press my lips together, force a faint smile, and reply, "I'm doing fine, Dad." He'd grunt a short, and end the call with his usual line. "Try to be more realistic, Zelda." Every time, it took me back to childhood where every accomplishment of mine came with a but. Jessica, on the other hand, seemed born to be praised. She worked in marketing for a cosmetics brand, nothing extraordinary, but my parents spoke of her as if she were the creative director of the entire industry. When Jessica got engaged, my mother called, her voice bursting with excitement I hadn't heard in years. "You won't believe it, Ben is the only son of the Henderson Hotel family. This wedding will be the event of the year." I congratulated her, though my heart sank. Since leaving home, I'd trained myself to regulate my emotions around them, not too happy, not too disappointed. Everything had to remain neutral, as if my heart had learned to live under low pressure. That Christmas, I returned to Colorado Springs after 3 years away. Outside, snow blanketed the streets, and the glow of holiday lights shimmered on every rooftop. But inside my family's kitchen, the warmth stopped at the door. My mother busied herself arranging the dinner table, my father played classical music, and Jessica showed off her engagement ring, the diamonds sparkling under the chandelier. I sat at the corner of the table, holding a glass of wine, listening as they discussed wedding venues, menus, and guest lists, everything revolving around Jessica. My mother said proudly, "Our youngest daughter has done so well. We couldn't be prouder." I smiled politely, even as a quiet ache pulsed in my chest. Dinner passed in a haze of laughter. After we finished eating, Jessica pulled me outside to the driveway to show off her new white car, gleaming under the porch lights. "My in-laws gave it to me," she said proudly. "Look, Italian leather seats, automatic heating, things you'd probably love, right?" I ran my hand over the cool surface of the paint and smiled. "It's beautiful." She grinned, her eyes sparkling. "You should find someone stable, you know. Living alone forever must be so lonely." I didn't respond. I had grown too used to the way they used the word stable as a measurement of worth. When we went back inside, my father was pouring himself another glass of wine. He looked at me for a moment before asking, just loud enough for everyone to hear, "Zelda, when are you going to be as settled as your sister?" The air went still. My mother nodded in agreement. "He's right, dear. You're not that young anymore." Jessica gave an awkward smile. Come on, don't pressure her. But even that gentle comment felt like a blade to the chest. I wanted to say that I had a good job, that I paid for my own place, that I'd built a career entirely on my own, but I knew that any attempt to explain would only sound like excuses for failure in their eyes. I set my glass down, met my father's gaze, and said quietly, "Dad, maybe I don't need to be stable like her, I just need to be myself." He frowned but said nothing. No one did. The ticking of the wall clock filled the silence, each beat cold and deliberate. Back in the present. When I finally reached my apartment in Denver, the clock had just passed 2 in the morning. I turned off the engine and sat there in the dark for a while, listening to the car settle into silence. The apartment greeted me with its familiar emptiness. I took off my coat, set my bag down, and looked around the white walls, the bookshelf, the unfinished blueprints on my desk, and the little plant by the window, wilted from neglect. Everything was neat, orderly, and lonely. I poured myself a glass of red wine, sat down on the sofa, and unlocked my phone. The screen lit up with dozens of unread messages in the Bennett family group chat. The latest one was a photo of Jessica showing off her wedding ring. My mother had reacted with a heart emoji, and my father had commented, "So proud of our youngest daughter." I stared at that line for a long time, as if looking at a wound that had been stitched shut but still bled underneath. Then I opened a private chat and began typing, my fingers trembling slightly. "From now on, I won't try to prove anything anymore. Thank you for teaching me to stand on my own, even in the cruelest way possible." I read it once, then hit send. When the message showed 2 blue ticks, it felt like a heavy stone dropped from my chest. Without waiting for a reply, I blocked both of their numbers and deleted the family group chat. Every photo, every old message from birthday wishes to petty complaints, I erased them all. Each time I pressed delete, my heart ached a little, but at the same time, I felt lighter. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat on the floor, my back against the wall, listening to the wind whistle through the window. The first feeling was fear. No more contact, no more family, no one left to send holiday messages. A part of me was still that 8-year-old child clutching a toy robot after my father had yanked out its cord, desperate for forgiveness. But by morning, as soft sunlight slipped through the curtains, all I felt was peace. The room looked the same, yet something inside me had changed. I no longer needed to measure my worth through anyone else's eyes. I had chosen silence not to punish them, but to save myself. The first weeks were not easy. Some mornings I woke up with a heavy sense of guilt, as if I'd committed a great crime against my family. Passing coffee shops, seeing families gathered around tables laughing and talking, my chest would tighten. I wondered if I had been too cruel. Were my parents sitting in that kitchen back in Colorado Springs, speaking about me in sad tones? But then I remembered every word they'd said, every look of disdain, every meal where I'd been shut out of the conversation. And I knew it wasn't me who had abandoned them. They had left me long ago. I had only found the courage to stop going back. One evening, I stepped out onto my balcony. The wind was sharp, and a thin layer of snow clung to the railing. I inhaled deeply and tilted my head up to the night sky. Winter in Denver has a strange kind of light cold, but crystalline. The city lay quiet as though asleep, only a few faint stars flickering overhead. I closed my eyes, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel lonely in the silence. I felt at peace. When you've lived your whole life under criticism, silence at first feels like emptiness. But gradually I realized silence was no longer a punishment. It had become a boundary between me and the old pain, a thin, fragile border, but enough for me to breathe. I didn't need them to exist. I didn't need their praise, nor their apologies. I only needed to know that, for the first time in 32 years, I was allowed to live without proving my worth to anyone. That night, I closed my laptop, set my phone on the table, and blew out the candle. I looked around the room, the soft yellow light reflecting off the walls, quiet, simple, and entirely my own. I whispered to myself, "That's enough now, Zelda. From this moment on, you don't have to try anymore." After cutting ties with my family, I threw all my energy into work, as if I could fill the emptiness inside by staying busy. In the early months of 2020, Denver was freezing, the sky a heavy gray that seemed to trap every bit of light. I worked almost without rest, took on extra projects, left early, came home late, sketched until my hands ached. I told myself that if I stayed busy enough, the pain wouldn't have time to speak. The company I worked for, a firm specializing in civil structures, had contracts with several new housing developments across the Front Range. I was promoted to technical manager, with a steady salary and the respect of my colleagues. To the outside world, I was the image of a strong, independent woman. But at night, in my quiet apartment, when the lights were off, I could still hear my father's voice echoing in my head. "It's too risky to trust you." Then one morning in March, the director called everyone into the conference room. I sat in the middle row, a cup of coffee still warm in my hands, but my heart went cold as soon as he spoke the first words. "I'm sorry, but the economic situation is forcing us to downsize." The room fell silent. I'd heard the news about the recession, the companies collapsing after the pandemic, but I still believed I was safe. I had worked hard, delivered results, never once received a complaint. But when the director read the list, my name was right there, in the middle, clear and non-negotiable. I walked out of the building just as snow began to fall. The termination letter was crumpled in my hand. The sense of failure spread through me like freezing water, seeping into my skin. Everything I'd worked so hard to prove that I wasn't the family's failure had been swept away by a single meeting. I had no parents, no job, no anchor but myself. The days that followed passed like an old, faded film reel. I sent out resumes everywhere, but most companies had frozen hiring. The apartment grew so quiet I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator. Every morning, I still woke early, made coffee, opened my laptop, but there were no projects left to work on. So I began sketching aimlessly tiny, eco-friendly home designs, something I'd always dreamed of, but never had the time to explore. I drew for myself, not for money. Maybe just to keep my mind from unraveling. Then one afternoon, while I was sitting in a small cafe near my apartment, a cozy place called Harlan's Corner, the owner, a man in his 60s with silver hair and paint-stained hands, walked up to my table. "You're Zelda Bennett, right? I heard you're a structural engineer." I looked up, surprised. "I used to be," I said. He smiled kindly. "Used to? Well, I could use someone to help me redo this place. It's gotten a bit tired. I don't have much money, but if you can do it for around $1,000, I'd like to hire you." I looked around. The cafe was small, maybe 40 square meters, with exposed brick walls, chipped furniture, and dull yellow lighting. It wasn't exactly a dream project, but for some reason, my heart stirred. "All right," I said. "I'll do it." In the days that followed, I came to the cafe almost every morning. I remeasured the space, sketched each corner, and picked materials that were cheap but durable. I didn't have a team, just a toolkit and my old laptop. Harlan always sat behind the counter, watching me work with a gentle gaze, occasionally making me a hot cappuccino. "You work hard," he said once. "I like this feeling," I replied, "the feeling of creating something you can actually touch." I decided to keep the original structure of the cafe but change the lighting and layout. I used reclaimed wood for the counter, hung a few glass pendant lamps, and repainted the walls in ash gray, adding a few small paintings by local artists. The total cost came to just over $800. When it was done, I stood back and looked around. It was still the same cafe, but now it breathed. Harlan stood in the middle of the room, eyes glistening. "I didn't think it could look this beautiful," he said. "Thank you." A week later, Harlan called me, his voice full of excitement. "Zelda, have you seen this article? A local magazine just featured my cafe. They're calling it a small space miracle." I opened my phone and saw a photo of me standing inside the cafe, the bright brick wall behind me and the caption. "A local engineer turned a forgotten coffee corner into a masterpiece of light and warmth." I read it over and over, not because of recognition, but because for the first time, Someone saw my worth, not through the name Bennett, not through my parents' shadow, but through my own hands. After the renovation project for Mr. Harlan's Cafe went viral across the local community, my inbox began to fill up every day. There were collaboration offers, small design requests, and even a few thank you messages from strangers who said my story had inspired them. I never imagined that a project worth only $1,000 could open an entirely new door for me. Gradually, I started taking on more renovation work, mostly small homes around Denver whose owners wanted to optimize their living space. One of those projects, an old brick house on the outskirts of Golden, would go on to change my life completely. The house belonged to a retired veteran who was moving in with his young daughter. When I arrived for the initial inspection, the person who opened the door wasn't the homeowner, but the man hired to assess the foundation and structure, Ethan Walker. He was about 35, tall, with neatly cut dark brown hair and calm gray eyes that held both strength and warmth. His hands were covered in cement dust, his sleeves rolled up, revealing faint scars running along his forearms. "You're Bennett, the architectural engineer, right?" he asked, his voice low and steady. I nodded. "And you're the one making sure this house doesn't collapse during construction?" He chuckled softly, but sincerely. "That's right, and I suppose you'll be the one making it beautiful again." In the days that followed, we worked side by side. I handled the design, and Ethan managed the structure and reinforcements. He was unlike any engineer I had met before, neither arrogant nor eager to prove himself. He worked slowly, with a meticulousness that bordered on meditative. Each morning, he arrived at the site before anyone else, brewed coffee for the crew, and inspected every steel bar, every joint. I found myself watching him, quietly amazed by his patience and calm precision. And somehow, I could feel that he was paying the same kind of attention to me. One afternoon, as I sat on the concrete floor sketching blueprints in the middle of the construction site, Ethan handed me a bottle of water. "You always focus so hard you forget the world exists," he said. I smiled. "If I don't, the design might collapse before it's even built." He looked at me for a long moment, then said softly, "No, I mean, I've never met anyone who looks at a house as if they can see its soul." I felt a flush rise to my cheeks and pretended not to hear. But that night, when I got home, his words echoed in my head, warm like the glow of a winter lamp spilling through a window. The more we worked together, the more I realized Ethan understood the value of silence. He didn't talk much, but when he did, every word came from a place of attention. When workers made mistakes, he never yelled, he simply corrected them, sometimes demonstrating it himself. He had once been a Marine, stationed in the Middle East, and had seen too many things fall apart to know that sometimes the only way to rebuild is to stay calm. I once asked him why he left the military. He replied, "Because I wanted to build things instead of destroy them." It was a simple answer, but it stopped me in my tracks because I saw myself in it. One Friday evening, after submitting our final project report, Ethan invited me to dinner. We chose a small restaurant near Sloan's Lake. Early spring in Denver still carried a bite in the air, but inside, the lighting was warm and the smell of toasted bread filled the room. At first, our conversation revolved around work materials, structures, the silly mistakes builders often made. But gradually, it grew more personal. He told me about his time in the barracks, about long nights in the desert where the only sounds were the wind and an old radio. I told him about my small studio, about that first cafe project, and the feeling of seeing my name in print for the very first time. "It sounds like you're starting to find yourself again," he said. I stayed quiet, swirling the wine in my glass. "Maybe," I answered softly. "But sometimes it still feels like I'm running away." He tilted his head, his gaze softening. "Running away from who?" I almost said from myself, but my lips pressed shut. I turned my eyes away and shifted the conversation. He didn't press me, only smiled, as if he understood there are wounds that don't need to be pried open. But that silence didn't last forever. A few weeks later, when the project wrapped up, Ethan came by to hand me the final technical documents. It was raining that day, and I invited him to stay for tea. We sat by the window, the sound of rain pouring down outside. After a few minutes of quiet, he said, "I notice you always avoid talking about your family. Whenever someone mentions them, your eyes change." I froze for a moment, then let out a slow sigh. Because they're no longer part of my life. He didn't react, just nodded, waiting. So I told him slowly, piece by piece. About a childhood spent on the sidelines. About the dinner where my father called me a failure. About the final message I sent in the middle of a snowy night. I didn't cry. I was too far beyond that pain for tears. When I finished, the room was utterly still. Ethan didn't speak for several seconds. Then he placed his hand on the table, near mine, not touching, but close enough for me to feel the warmth. "You don't need their approval," he said quietly. "You've already proved yourself with the life you've built." The words were simple, but they felt like someone loosening a rope that had been tied around my chest for years. I took a deep breath, feeling lighter for the first time. He didn't pity me, didn't try to give advice, he simply acknowledged my worth as something self-evident. From then on, we began working together more often. Ethan started joining several of my studio's smaller projects. He had a practical vision, and I had a creative instinct, two seemingly opposite forces that somehow fit together perfectly. One evening, while we were discussing a client's request for an eco-friendly compact home, Ethan suddenly said, "Have you ever thought about creating a sustainable living model? A house that can generate its own energy, save materials, but still feel warm and beautiful?" I looked at him, my eyes lighting up. "You're reading my mind. I've wanted to do that since college but never had the chance." He smiled. "Then maybe now's the time. What should we call it?" I paused for a moment before replying. "The Eco Home Project." He nodded. "Perfect. You handle the design, I'll handle the engineering and construction. Together, we'll prove that small doesn't mean less." We shook hands, and in that instant, I realized this meeting between us was never just about work. Ethan hadn't come into my life to save me, he had simply appeared at the exact moment I was ready to rebuild myself. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel alone anymore. That summer, after months of non-stop projects around the city, Ethan suggested we take a few days off to recharge. I remember that afternoon clearly. He knocked on the studio door, holding 2 cups of coffee and a folded map. "Ever been to the Oregon coast?" he asked, his tone casual but carrying a hint of something deeper. I shook my head. He smiled. "Then we're going this weekend. Just a few days. No work, no emails, no pressure." I wasn't the kind of person who easily detached from work, but the way he said it, firm yet gentle, made me nod without hesitation. 3 days later, we drove out of Denver in Ethan's old pickup truck just as dawn was breaking. I sat in the passenger seat, holding a cup of coffee, watching the Rocky Mountains shrink in the rearview mirror. The farther we went, the more the air changed. The dry chill of the mountains gave way to the damp scent of pine forests, and soon the faint smell of salt began to drift through the open window. When the truck rounded the last curve and the Oregon coastline unfolded before us, my heart tightened. It was breathtaking, vast, and endless. The ocean stretched deep blue beneath a sky draped in mist, the cliffs carpeted with moss and fog. The sea breeze carried a salty sharpness, tossing my hair, and for a moment, I felt so small I could dissolve into the world itself. We stopped in a small coastal town called Manzanita. Wooden houses stood close together with slanted roofs, thin trails of smoke curling from their chimneys. Ethan rented a weathered cabin nestled near the forest, where the sound of crashing waves blended with the whisper of wind through the trees. On our first morning there, I woke earlier than he did, brewed coffee, and sat on the porch. The first light of day filtered through the mist, scattering silver across the surface of the sea. I felt an unfamiliar stillness settle inside me, a peace I hadn't known in years. It wasn't the silence of loneliness, it was the quiet of someone who had finally found where they belonged. That afternoon, as we drove down a narrow road skirting the forest, Ethan suddenly slowed down. "Look," he said. I glanced up and saw a weathered wooden sign tilted slightly by the roadside. The white paint was fading, but the words were still visible. "For sale, 5 acres. Below it, a handwritten phone number and a price, $85,000. Behind the sign, a dirt path disappeared into a lush green forest, and from somewhere beyond the trees came the muffled crash of waves against rock. "Let's check it out," Ethan said, half joking, half serious. I laughed. "You're thinking of buying a forest now?" He grinned. "No," he said, "just thought we should see what destiny looks like." The road leading into the property was uneven, overgrown with knee-high grass, but the moment I stepped out of the truck, I froze. Before me stretched an open clearing, sloping gently toward the ocean, encircled by towering Douglas firs. Sunlight filtered through the branches, scattering golden patches across the ground. In the distance, beyond the line of trees, I could see a narrow stream trickling toward the sea. The sight was so breathtaking it felt unreal. I stood still as the wind swept through my hair, the scent of salt and pine resin mingling in the air. Without warning, tears welled up. I didn't know why I was crying, maybe because, after all these years, I had never felt so connected to something. Not to a person, not to a house, but to the land itself. To nature, the one place where I could truly begin again. Ethan stood beside me, silent for a while before quietly asking, "What are you thinking?" I wiped my tears and smiled faintly. "I think this is where I'm meant to be." He looked at me and nodded. "Then let's call the owner." The man who answered was named George. His voice was raspy and tired, yet warm. He agreed to meet us later that afternoon. When he arrived, he stepped out of an old pickup truck, a thin, white-haired man with kind, alert eyes. "You two here to see the land?" he asked, with a gentle smile. I nodded and explained our plan, a small, sustainable cabin that could generate its own energy, built from reclaimed materials. "A prototype for our eco-home project," I added, a little embarrassed at how ambitious it sounded. But George didn't laugh. He stood quietly, scanning the land, then turned back to us, his expression softening. "You know," he said, "I've had this land for over 40 years. I once planned to build a little house here for my wife, but she passed away before I could. Since then, I've never touched it. Hearing you talk about your project today, maybe it's finally going to be used the right way." Ethan asked, "Are you still selling it for $85,000? George smiled. "If I were younger, I'd give it to you two for free, but tell you what, I'll lower it to 75. Call it my faith in young people who still dare to dream." I froze. I only had $60,000 in my savings account, the money I'd spent years setting aside. Ethan glanced at me and understood immediately. "I'll cover the rest," he said quietly. "We'll draw up an agreement, divide the investment and ownership fairly. No strings attached, just equality." I looked at him for a long moment, and in his eyes I saw no pity, only pure respect. "Are you sure?" I asked. "I'm sure," he replied. "Sometimes, to build something big, it takes two sets of hands." We shook hands with George that very day. He showed us the land title, explaining that there was no house, only a dry well and a few old boundary markers. When we signed the deposit papers, his hand trembled slightly. Then he looked at me with an earnest gaze. "People think you need money to start something," he said, "but really, all you need is faith, and I see that in both of you." I couldn't find any words, just nodded softly. By the time we left, the sun was already setting. The golden light poured over the forest, and the wind rustled the leaves like quiet whispers. Sitting in the truck, holding the contract in my hands, I felt as if I were holding something sacred. Ethan glanced over and smiled. "Welcome to your new life, landowner Bennett." I laughed through my tears. That night, I opened my notebook and wrote on the first page. "Today, among the pines and the sound of the sea, I bought 5 acres of land, not just with money, but with faith. For the first time in my life, I own something no one can take away from me, a piece of land that is mine." The first days after buying the land were filled with misty mornings and hands sticky with pine resin. The patch of forest near the Oregon coast had no electricity, no paved road, only the wind, the scent of salt, and air so pure it silenced every thought. Ethan and I set up a temporary tent near a small stream, using it as both a workspace and a resting place. Each morning, we made coffee with boiled water on a portable gas stove and watched the fog lift slowly as sunlight filtered through the pine branches like ribbons of gold. Amid that quiet, I spread my blueprints across an old wooden table, and Ethan leaned beside me, pencil in hand, helping me redraw the dream. The house in my blueprint was called Evergreen Cabin, a name that symbolized something unyielding, untouched by time. We agreed on 3 principles: small, simple, sustainable. 600 square feet enough for 2 people with a kitchen, a workspace, a loft for sleeping, and a wide porch that opened toward the forest. Ethan wanted the cabin to breathe with nature, while I wanted every detail to carry the mark of human hands, imperfect but honest. We decided to use reclaimed pine from an abandoned barn in Astoria. It was economical and perfectly aligned with the spirit of the Eco Home Project. The first month was all about clearing land, cutting grass, gathering debris, and setting up a basic drainage system. Even on rainy days when mud reached our ankles, we kept working. Ethan joked, "This is the best $0 outdoor gym in Oregon." I laughed. If I lose weight, I'm blaming the cabin. But on stormy nights, lying in the tent listening to the wind roar through the trees, I felt both smaller and stronger than ever before. When the foundation and wooden frame began to rise, friends from Denver flew in to help. Marcus, the owner of Harlan's Corner, brought his entire cafe staff, saying, "I owe you, so let me pay in sweat." A few former clients from my studio came too, carrying tools, food, and encouragement. Each person contributed a small piece, and as I looked around the worksite, I realized I was watching a community form not by blood, but by choice. Ethan was the soul of the build. He understood structure the way most people understand breathing. Whenever exhaustion hit me, he'd say, "One plank at a time, Zelda. It doesn't have to be perfect, it just has to move forward." I remember one morning so cold my hands cracked and bled, yet he still carried heavy timber beside me, telling old military stories just to make me laugh. At night, we'd sit by the fire, drink cold beer, and talk about the future, about the people who would one day live in sustainable homes, about how we could expand this model to help entire communities. By the 4th month, when the roof of the cabin was finally in place, I began designing the interior. With no real budget, I did almost everything myself. The kitchen counter from old pine boards, lamps made out of recycled glass bottles, bookshelves built from discarded window frames. I remember those mornings at the town's flea market, coffee in hand, discovering pieces of material that seemed worthless but were strangely beautiful. I painted, sanded, and assembled, and every time a detail came together, happiness spread through me like an electric current. Ethan watched me work and laughed. "I've never seen anyone love every single nail the way you do." I smiled. "Every nail is an act of defiance, you wouldn't understand." Sometimes the workload crushed me. My body ached, my shoulders burned, my hands were raw and scratched. I remember one evening, drilling into a wall when the tool broke, and I burst into tears. Ethan pulled me into his arms and whispered, "You don't have to prove anything to anyone. This cabin doesn't have to be perfect, it just has to be yours." His words silenced me. In that moment, I realized that maybe what I was building wasn't only a house, but also the part of myself my parents had once denied. By the 6th month, the frame of the house was complete. When the first light streamed through the glass panes I had installed with my own hands, I stood in the room, still smelling of fresh wood, and tears welled up. I thought of my 15-year-old self, the night I buried the robot lamp beneath the oak tree behind our house, a girl who once believed her dreams were worthless. Now she was standing inside a home she had built herself. By the 10th month, Evergreen Cabin was complete. We kept its name true to the spirit of the project: Evergreen, something that never fades, that stands tall through time. The small cabin stood quietly in the forest, with a slanted matte metal roof, pale wooden walls, and wide windows opening toward the endless sky. Inside, natural light filled every corner. Everything was simple, uncluttered, and warm. Ethan planted a row of saplings along the path, while I placed a small lamp on the window ledge made from a block of wood and a glass bulb, a reborn version of the robot lamp from my childhood. On the afternoon we finished, we sat on the porch, watching the sun dip behind the pines. I took a single photo of the cabin bathed in golden light, the forest behind it. I posted it on social media with a short caption. Built this. Proud. No hashtags, no ads, no pretense. I only wanted to mark the moment, to keep a record of healing. But by the next morning, the post had gone viral. Thousands of shares, hundreds of messages pouring in from all over. People wrote that my story made them believe in new beginnings. A local architecture magazine reached out, asking to interview me about sustainable microhomes. A popular blogger published a feature titled, Evergreen Cabin, the tiny house built with enormous strength. And then something extraordinary happened. My studio inbox exploded with inquiries. Young couples seeking minimalist lives, environmental groups, small families, everyone wanted an evergreen cabin of their own. I remember Ethan bringing me a newspaper, placing it on the table, pointing to the headline. Bennett Design Studio, the future of sustainable living. I stared at the words for a long time. Everything inside me went still, not because of pride, but because I knew this journey hadn't started with $150,000 or anyone's approval. It had started with a wound, and that wound had become the foundation of a new life. That evening, I stepped out onto the porch. The air carried the scent of pine and the distant crash of waves. I whispered to myself. I didn't need anyone's $150,000. I turned my wounds into my foundation. And in that brilliant golden sunset, I felt it clearly for the first time in years. I was truly standing on my own. 2 years had passed since Evergreen Cabin was completed, yet I still remembered every morning there, the soft light filtering through the pine branches, the scent of fresh wood mingling with roasted coffee, and the sound of the wind slipping through the narrow gaps in the wooden walls, like the steady breath of nature itself. My life had become beautifully simple, almost meditative. I was no longer in Denver, no more meetings, no more deadlines, no more chasing validation through numbers and skeptical glances. I lived in the forest, but I was not alone. My studio had grown into a small but respected brand in sustainable home design. I worked remotely, managing a team of architects and engineers online. Every week, new emails arrived from people who wanted to begin again, just like you did, Zelda. Lie. To my surprise, Evergreen Cabin had become a symbol. Young people came to visit, taking photos and posting with the hashtag number #EvergreenStart. Some women wrote that seeing the cabin made them believe they too could rise again after being called failures. I never saw myself as someone to be admired. I was simply someone who chose not to stay down. But when I read their words, I saw fragments of myself, the girl who once sat in the dark, dismissed by her own family, yet still believed she deserved something more. Ethan and I were still together, living and working as two halves of the same project. He sometimes traveled for site work, while I stayed at the cabin tending to the garden, sketching new designs, and teaching online classes about small sustainable homes. Our life wasn't loud, but it was full of meaning. It was a kind of peace I had never known in the first 30 years of my life. That morning, the May sky was crystal clear. I was kneeling by the porch, wearing gloves, planting lavender along the path. The breeze carried a faint trace of salt from the distant sea, brushing against my skin. I was smiling to myself, thinking about what to cook for dinner, when I heard the sudden screech of tires at the gate. The sharp sound shattered the calm of the forest like glass breaking. I stood up, brushed the dirt from my hands, and stepped onto the porch. A silver BMW had stopped right in front of the small wooden sign that read, Evergreen Cabin, Private Property. The car door opened, and the person who stepped out made me freeze. Jessica. My sister. I hadn't seen her in 2 years. It was still the same face, delicate, polished to perfection, wearing a pristine white dress and a designer handbag slung over her shoulder. But something about her posture was completely different this time. Trembling, uncertain, her eyes wide with panic, like someone who had stumbled into a world she didn't belong to. She stepped out, holding her phone to her ear, her voice shaking. "Dad, You need to come here. Now. Her voice cracked through the air, raw with fear, like a child crying for help. I stepped down from the porch, my heart pounding, but my voice calm. Jessica, what's going on? She stopped, looking at me, and, for a moment, her eyes filled with disbelief. You, she stammered. You live here? Oh my God, I can't believe this. Dad and Mom said you were bankrupt, that you ran off somewhere in the mountains. They said you lost everything. Her gaze swept around the cabin, the light wood walls, the big sunlit windows, the garden I'd grown myself. I just stood there, still holding my gardening gloves, smiling faintly. What they think doesn't matter anymore, Jessica. But you, why are you shaking? She went quiet, her lips trembling. A gust of wind swept through, tossing a few strands of her blonde hair across her face. Her voice softened, I just didn't expect you to be living like this. I raised an eyebrow. What do you mean by this? She looked down at her high heels, now smeared with mud, then back up, her eyes glistening with tears. You have everything. Without anyone's help. And me. Her voice broke. After the divorce, I'm still living in the house Mom and Dad bought. They still pay for everything. Every time I try to do something on my own, Mom says, don't be reckless like your sister, and I listen. I didn't say anything. Only the sound of the waves carried from far away and the slow, unfamiliar beat of my own heart. I didn't hate her. What I felt was a quiet ache for both of us, two daughters raised under the same roof but taught opposite lessons. I had been taught to be strong until I turned to stone, and she had been taught that weakness was the only way to be loved. Jessica stepped closer, running her fingers over the cabin wall. You built all of this yourself? She asked, her voice almost a whisper. I nodded. Every plank, every stone. With the help of friends, the people who believed in the sister, our parents called a failure. She gave a small laugh, but it was thin and brittle. Mom and Dad won't believe it. They still tell everyone you're out there struggling somewhere. That you're stubborn, that you don't listen. I smiled faintly. They need that story, Jessica. It's easier than facing the truth that they were wrong. She went quiet, her head bowing. Sunlight filtered through the branches and fell across her shoulders, making her look more fragile than I'd ever seen her. After a moment, she spoke, her voice so soft it nearly dissolved into the wind. I just realized, you don't need them anymore, and I still do. The words fell like a small, sharp cut that went deep. I looked at her, no arrogance now, no trace of the chosen child. In front of me stood a woman afraid of her own life. I wanted to hold her, but I knew if I did, she would break down. Instead, I placed my hand on the window ledge and stared out at the trees. You know, Jessica, I said quietly. The day they called me a failure was the day I began to find myself. Maybe they had to be wrong so that we could finally have the chance to be right. She lifted her gaze, eyes brimming with tears. I'm jealous of you, she blurted out, as if afraid she might take it back. You have freedom, you have yourself. But me. Her voice faltered. I'm just the version they wanted. I don't even know who I am anymore. I stepped closer, my voice gentle. Then stop living for them. She shook her head and gave a sad, trembling smile. Easier said than done. I nodded, I understood. I had been there before, knowing exactly which mountain I had to climb, yet too afraid to leave the ground. After a moment, she turned away and spoke quietly into her phone to our parents, I guessed saying that, everything's fine. When she hung up, I asked, what did you tell them? She replied, that you don't need saving, and maybe they should start looking at themselves. Before leaving, she stood at the gate for a long time, looking at me. Are you happy? She asked. I smiled. For the first time in my life, I think I am. She nodded, her eyes red, then climbed into the car. The silver BMW turned on the narrow path, its tires crunching over gravel sharp, dry, fading into the distance. I stayed there, watching until the sound of the engine blended with the crash of the sea. A gentle breeze swept through, carrying the scent of the lavender I had just planted. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. Inside me, there was no anger left, only a strange, quiet peace. A peace I had bought with 2 years of silence and freedom. And somewhere far down the road, perhaps Jessica was crying not for me, but because, for the first time, she realized who had truly been left behind. About an hour after Jessica left, as the sun began to tilt toward the forest, I heard the familiar sound of tires grinding over gravel, heavy, urgent, and full of tension. I didn't need to look to know it was my father's black SUV. The vehicle slid into the driveway, braking so abruptly that dust rose and settled in a pale film over the wooden sign. Evergreen Cabin, private property. I stood on the porch, pruning shears still in hand, watching calmly as they stepped out. My mother was the first to open the door. Her face was pale, lipstick faded, eyes filled with a tangle of emotions: anger, confusion, and something that almost looked like fear. My father followed, his posture as rigid as ever, but his face tight, veins visible along his neck. Jessica stood between them, hands trembling slightly, eyes fixed on the ground, unsure which side to stand on. "Where did you get the money to do all this?" my father said, his voice clipped, skipping any greeting or pretense of civility. His words struck the air like a cold slap. He scanned the cabin, the trees, the small garden, and finally the solar panels on the roof. "Don't tell me you built all of this from your savings. This is a serious project. What are you hiding?" I stayed silent for a few seconds, then set the shears on the wooden table, wiped my hands with a cloth, and stepped toward him. My voice was low but steady. "From the day you both called me a failure." He frowned, confused. I met his eyes and continued. "Every time you said I wasn't good enough, I worked overtime. Every time you compared me to Jessica, I learned a new skill. Every time you laughed at my dreams, I stayed up all night figuring out how to make them real. Every look of contempt, every word of doubt, that was the capital I used to build this place." My mother gripped her handbag tightly, her voice trembling. "Zelda, we only wanted what's best for you. We never meant to hurt you." I let out a short, dry laugh that echoed in the still air. "What's best for me?" I asked, stepping closer. "Or what's best for your image? You don't want a child who dares to take a different path, who might fail, who is different. You want a perfect story to tell at parties. A child to show off, not to understand." My mother froze, tears slipping down her cheeks, but she made no rebuttal. My father turned away, pacing around the cabin as if searching for a crack to prove I was lying. He examined the walls, the roof, the window frames. With each step he took, my chest grew heavier. I could tell he was torn between believing and not believing, between the image of the failure daughter he had built in his mind and the woman standing before him now, steady and unafraid. Ethan stepped out of the house then, calm but decisive. He merely nodded in greeting and stood quietly beside me. My father's eyes flicked toward him, a flash of confusion crossing his face. Perhaps he had heard the rumor that I was living alone in the woods, that no one cared. Now the man before him saw that I was neither lonely nor pitiable. The only one left behind was him, stranded in the dust of old prejudices. "Did you do all this to get revenge?" my father asked, his voice low and choked. I shook my head. "No, Dad. If I wanted revenge, I would have sent a bill. But I don't need to do that. Every morning you wake up in the house you thought was stable, and I wake up in the place I built with my own hands. This is my victory." The air went still. Only the distant sound of the sea remained, crashing in steady waves like a heartbeat. My father turned back to me, his eyes no longer sharp, no longer full of contempt, but something else entirely. Heavy, conflicted, fragile. He opened his mouth, but it took several seconds before he could speak. "We were wrong." Those 4 words fell like a bell toll. My mother broke into tears, covering her face with both hands. My father stood motionless, fingers interlaced, staring at the ground. Then, slowly, he asked, "Can you forgive us?" His voice was small, tired, like a man who had just laid down a burden he'd carried for years. I stayed silent. Ethan gently squeezed my hand, as if to remind me I didn't have to say anything. But I still lifted my gaze, looking out toward the forest where the last of the evening light scattered through the trees. I don't need to forgive to be free, I said softly. I already found it. They both stood there, silent. My mother sniffled, turning away to wipe her tears with her sleeve. My father exhaled, no longer hiding his age or his weariness. I didn't say anything more. Everything had been spoken, nothing needed to be repeated. They left as dusk settled in. I watched the SUV disappear down the gravel road, my heart free of hatred. All that remained was a strange feeling, as though I had just closed a long chapter of my life. Ethan stepped beside me, draped a coat over my shoulders. "You okay?" he asked. I nodded, my eyes still following the line of the forest road. "I'm okay, for the first time in my life, truly okay." That night, I sat by the cabin window, the golden light reflecting off the wood, and wrote a few lines in my journal. Forgiveness isn't to let them sleep soundly. It's so I don't have to wake up every day with the old pain. Outside, the wind swept through the pine trees, carrying a soft whisper that felt like an answer. And I knew, from that moment on, everything had truly changed, not because they finally said, "We were wrong," but because I no longer needed to hear it to know I was right. A week after that encounter, when the early winter sun slanted through the forest and a thin layer of frost still clung to the cabin windows, I received a thick, cream-colored envelope in the mail. There was no return address, only the words, "To Zelda," written in a familiar hand, neat, measured, as if composed with the shame of someone trying to preserve their dignity. I knew instantly it was from my father. I sat for a long while before opening it, my hands trembling slightly. Inside were 2 sheets of paper, a long letter, and a photograph of our old house in Colorado Springs, Colorado, with a "For Sale" sign out front. At the bottom of the photo was a short line. "We sold the house. Maybe it's time to start over." I unfolded the letter. My father's handwriting was shakier now, no longer sharp and confident. He wrote that he and my mother had talked for many nights, realizing that all these years they had loved me in the worst possible way, loving with conditions, loving through expectations, loving by comparison. He said my mother had cried often, ashamed for not protecting me from her own favoritism. They had decided to leave behind the house that had become too big, too quiet, where every wall carried both Jessica's shadow and my absence. "If you don't want to see us again, we understand," he wrote. "But know this, for the first time in our lives, we are truly proud of you." I folded the letter and placed it on the wooden table. No tears, no smile. A part of me had longed to hear those words for decades, but when they finally came, all I felt was an unfamiliar calm. I didn't write back, I didn't call, I didn't even keep the photo. Instead, I stepped outside, where the cold wind swept through the forest and the air smelled of pine and damp soil. In a corner of the yard, I dug a small hole and placed inside a young pine tree I'd brought back from town. As I covered it with earth, I whispered, "For a new beginning." For myself. Ethan stood a few steps away, hands in his pockets, watching me with a quiet, warm smile. When I finished patting down the last bit of soil, he walked toward me, holding a small walnut box carved with delicate, handmade patterns. "I made this from the first tree we cut to build the cabin," he said, his voice low and steady. I opened the box. Inside was a simple ring, a slender loop of polished wood, coated with a soft wax sheen. No diamond, no gold, just warmth and truth. "Zelda Bennett," he said, kneeling in the damp earth, "will you keep building with me? Not just cabins, but the rest of our lives?" I laughed through tears. In the middle of the forest, surrounded by the scent of pine and the hum of the wind, I nodded. "Yes. But this time, we draw the blueprint together." He smiled and pulled me close. Above us, sunlight filtered through the treetops, scattering in golden streaks like quiet blessings. That evening, as the sun sank behind the forest, I sat on the cabin steps, watching the firelight flicker on the glass window. Ethan was inside cooking dinner, and I opened my notebook, the one I'd used to write down every step of my journey. I wrote, "They once gave my sister $150,000. They gave me silence. But that silence became the greatest gift because in it, I found my voice. I don't need to be acknowledged, I just need to be myself, and that's enough. 1. The wind drifted through the forest, stirring the pages of my notebook. I closed my eyes, listening to the sound of waves in the distance blending with the whisper of the trees, a gentle symphony of healing. In that moment, I understood that everything had come full circle. No more apologies were needed, no more proof was required. It was enough to know that the child once called a failure had built a life of freedom with her own hands and her own faith. One late afternoon, as the sun poured gold through the pines, I heard the soft sound of a car pulling up outside the gate. I stepped out and saw a familiar silver vehicle. Jessica. She didn't step out, only rolled down her window. Her hair was tied neatly, her face free of heavy makeup, her eyes softer than I remembered. She looked at me, then at the cabin behind me, and smiled a small, quiet smile, without pride or shame, only peace. I nodded and smiled back. No words, no apologies. Just two women who finally understood where they belonged in the world. She spoke softly, almost a whisper. "You're really happy, aren't you?" I answered, "Yes. And you can be too, if you choose to live for yourself." Jessica said nothing, then nodded slowly. She started the car and drove away unhurried, without looking back. But I knew this time, she wasn't running anymore. I stood there, watching the sunlight bathe the forest in gold. The cabin's shadow stretched long and steady across the ground. I whispered, mostly to myself, sometimes, revenge isn't about making them hurt, it's about letting them see you happy without needing them anymore. The wind brushed through the young pine trees I had planted, their leaves trembling as if in agreement. I turned back inside, where the warm light spilled through the cabin windows and Ethan was waiting with a smile. Behind me, the forest spoke the sound of peace, of new beginnings. And I knew, wherever life took me, I would always carry this place within me, Evergreen Cabin, a symbol of resilience, of freedom, and of a woman who finally learned how to love herself.